Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, we delve into the weary fields of the Songhai Empire and the lives of the farmers who bent their backs beneath the sun, the rain, and the relentless demands of kings. The Songhai were mighty. They ruled rivers, traded across deserts, and commanded armies that struck fear into their neighbors. But at the heart of all empires lies something quieter, less spoken of. The people who tilled the land. Without them, there would be no millet in the pot, no rice in the bowl, no tribute carried to Gao or Timbuktu. And yet, to be a farmer in the Songhai lands was no gentle life. The soil might be rich one year, cracked and barren the next. The Niger could swell with life-giving floods, or rise too high and wash away the fields. Tribute weighed heavy. A man's harvest was never fully his own. So tonight, we step into those fields. We walk barefoot across damp furrows. We listen to the frogs croak after the rains, and to the silent cries of families who feared both famine and tax collectors. This is the story of toil, of endurance, and of the unbroken rhythm of hands meeting earth. So let's settle here, beneath the great baobab tree. The stars above stretch wide. The night is cool, and the fire is low. You are now under baobab skies. The first rays of sun slant through the tall grasses, painting stripes of gold on the mud walls of the village. Beside each hut, a small patch of cleared land, a kitchen garden where yams and cassava hide beneath broad leaves. Further out, beyond the cluster of homes, the fields begin. Here, the Songhai king's hold is strongest. Every second or third strip of land belongs to him, set aside to gather tribute. On the king's fields, men and women pull weeds and coax life from the stubborn soil, their movements as rhythmic as the swelling and falling of their breaths. Each furrow they turn over has been turned over countless times before by countless hands. The work is hard, but the soil is good. This is the rainy season, and the land is soft, giving way underfoot and smelling of rich, dark water, where the river god has blessed the fields. The millet and sorghum stand shoulder to shoulder, their green stalks heavy with promise. The women gather the stalks into bundles, their fingers nimble despite the cuts and scars that mar their skin. From the youngest to the oldest, all are here in the fields. Children with small hands weed the king's crops, earning a small allowance of grain. Husbands and wives work side by side, their bodies swaying in unison as they clear weeds from the millet. Grandparents squat beside the rows, their eyes sharp despite their age, ensuring the crops get the water they need. Some fields belong to the village elder. He is a man apart, his status marked by the deep lines etched on his forehead and the silver on his wrists. Though he owns these fields, he works them with the others, sharing in the sweat and the dust. For the village elder is not only keeper of history and tradition, he is also a farmer, feeding his family and paying his dues to the king. In the distance, the call to prayer echoes from the minaret of a nearby mosque. It is the noontime prayer, and for a brief moment, the fields are silent. Men, women, and children drop their tools and rush to the mosque. Kneeling on mats, they turn their faces toward Mecca, seeking solace and strength in the midday sun. When the call to prayer ends, they return to their work, their bodies bent but unbroken. As the sun dips below the horizon, the fields fall quiet. The villagers gather their tools, their bodies aching, their hands calloused, their faces streaked with dirt. The frogs begin their evening chorus, and fireflies wink in the gathering darkness. One by one, the villagers return to their huts, carrying with them the day's sweat and the silent hope for rain. Soon, the sound of hammers will give way to the murmur of family meals. The rhythmic thud of pestles and mortar will blend with the laughter of children and the low hum of evening prayers. For now, the fields are empty, but tomorrow the sun will rise again, painting the sky with the promise of a new day. And the farmers, their bodies rested, their spirits strengthened, will return to the fields to continue the ancient dance between man and earth. As the last embers fade in the dying fire, a lone star shines bright above the baobab tree. Its light, a silent witness to the farmers' tireless work, their hopes and their dreams. Beneath this star, we end our night. Our story for tonight is done. But the song of the fields, the rhythm of the seasons, the dance of life and toil will continue until the next time we gather beneath the baobab tree. Until then, sleep well. Dream of sun-kissed fields and rain-filled skies. For the farmers' work is never done, but their spirit, like the soil they till, is forever renewed. You are now under baobab skies, and the story begins now. In the heart of the vast Songhai Empire, long before the sun's first rays painted the sky, a farmer's day began. His life wasn't governed by clocks or calendars, but by the ever-shifting moods of the great Niger River and the unpredictable dance of the rains. Imagine a world where one season your fields are swallowed by a ravenous flood, drowning the young seedlings before they even have a chance to breathe. And in the next, the earth bakes into a hard, cracked shell, the very ground gasping for a single drop of mercy. To be a farmer here was to exist in a constant state of negotiation with nature. It was more than just physical labor. It was a profound act of submission. It was a daily dialogue with a river that was both the source of life and a force of immense destruction, capable of taking everything away in a heartbeat. This wasn't just a job. It was a life lived on the edge of possibility and peril. Perhaps the most unforgiving chapter in the farmer's year was the hunger season. This was the grueling period after the last basket in the granary was empty, but before the new harvest could replenish it. During these long, lean weeks, families survived on whatever they could find: wild berries, a thin, watery porridge, or roots dug from the edges of the parched fields. At night, the quiet was often broken by the cries of hungry children. Mothers would add more and more water to the cooking pot, a small, desperate act of magic, hoping to stretch a single handful of grain into a meal that could soothe empty bellies until morning. The farmer understood that every single day was a gamble. A sudden, violent storm could wipe out months of backbreaking effort in a matter of minutes. A swarm of locusts, descending like a dark, devouring cloud, could leave behind nothing but chewed stalks and dust. In these moments of profound uncertainty, the people looked not only to the river and the sky, but also to their ancestors. They would whisper prayers into the wind, hoping their tireless toil would not be in vain, that their pleas would be heard. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling softly as we rest beneath a canopy of stars, letting the weight of this reality sink in. The tools of the trade were strikingly simple. A wooden hoe may be tipped with a sliver of precious iron, if a family was fortunate enough to afford it, yet these humble instruments demanded extraordinary strength. From dawn till dusk, the farmer would be bent low, his body a tight coil of muscle, hacking at persistent weeds. His sweat fell into the very soil he prayed would one day feed his children. There was no break, no moment of relief. Work began with the first blush of light, and only ended when darkness wrapped the land in a deep, profound silence. Even then, sleep was rarely peaceful. The mind would remain restless, filled with dreams of ploughing straight furrows, of flowing water, of planting and reaping. This rhythm of labor was ancient, a cycle repeated for countless generations, but its demands never lessened. In the muscles of every farmer was the inherited memory of all those who came before them, all who had bent to this same soil, whispered these same desperate pleas to the unblinking skies. Their strength was a legacy, their struggle a continuation of a story as old as the land itself. The river, the lifeblood of the empire, was a double-edged sword. When the annual floods were just right, they deposited a rich, dark layer of silt along the banks, a thick blanket of promise for an abundant harvest. But when the waters rose too high, that promise turned into a nightmare. Entire fields would vanish beneath the powerful current. Villages, huddled on slightly higher ground, could only watch helplessly as their homes, their livestock, and their precious rows of millet were swallowed whole by the churning water. And in times of drought, the same villages would stand over dry, cracked furrows, their hands outstretched toward skies that stubbornly refused to open. There's an old proverb from the region that says, "The farmer may plan his rows, but the river decides the harvest." It's a simple truth, spoken with a mixture of weary resignation and a deep, biding reverence for the immense power that governed their lives. It was an acknowledgement that no matter how hard they worked, the final say always belonged to forces far beyond their control. Let's take another pause. The fire dims to glowing embers, and the night grows deeper. We feel the stillness of the land and the weight of that ancient proverb. To be a farmer in the Songhai lands was to walk a razor's edge between survival and despair. Every seed planted in the ground was a prayer. Every harvest was a final reckoning. The land was both a cruel, demanding teacher and a generous, nurturing parent. And though the farmer surely cursed it in moments of frustration and loss, he also knew, deep in his bones, that without it, there would be no life at all. The earth gave everything, and it could take everything. The Songhai farmer was so much more than just a worker of fields. He was a gambler, placing his bets against nature's whims. He was a poet whose verses were written in sweat upon the soil. He was a humble servant, bowing to forces that dwarfed his own existence. His life, though incredibly fragile, was inextricably tied to the eternal, cyclical rhythm of the earth and the river. And it was this very rhythm, this constant struggle and resilience, that shaped the great Songhai Empire itself. The empire didn't just rise from the ambitions of kings and the might of armies. It rose on the strong, tired backs of its farmers. Their silent struggles, their tireless work in the fields, fed not only their own families, but also the entire structure of their civilization, from the humblest soldier to the most powerful monarch. Their story is the hidden foundation upon which an empire was built. The farmers' struggle did not end with the whims of nature. Even in years when the rains were kind and the harvest abundant, there loomed another shadow over his household, the burden of tribute. From the king's officials in their fine robes to the local chiefs and tax collectors, many hands reached into the farmer's granary before his own family had even tasted the fruits of the season's labor. To farm in the Songhai Empire was not simply to feed one's own family, it was to feed an entire empire. The millet that filled the farmer's basket would become porridge for soldiers on distant campaigns. The rice, carefully gathered in woven mats, would fill the pots of bustling markets far from his village. Even the goats and chickens, raised with such care and affection, could be demanded as tribute at a moment's notice. Tribute wasn't always met with resentment. Some saw it as a sacred duty, a recognition that the king's power was what protected the trade routes from raiders, what kept the markets thriving and the empire secure. It was the price of peace and prosperity. But for others, especially in lean years when the harvest was poor, it was a source of deep and lasting bitterness. To hand over precious grain while one's own children cried from hunger was a wound that cut deep into the spirit, a pain that lingered long after the collectors were gone. Often the tax collector did not arrive alone. He came with a retinue of scribes, warriors, or enforcers to ensure the tally was exact and the payment complete. Their presence was a stark reminder of the power they wielded. A missed payment wasn't a simple matter of negotiation. It could mean public lashes, the confiscation of land passed down through generations, or the deep shaming of a family before their entire village. In hushed whispers around the evening fire, farmers would mutter that sometimes the king's men took more than was due, their greedy hands pocketing a portion for themselves. But who could dare to challenge such men? To resist was to invite ruin upon oneself and one's family. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly and we rest beneath the stars. And so, the farmer lived his life caught between two relentless hungers. The first was the hunger of the field, its constant uncertainty whether the rains would bless him with life-giving water or curse him with drought. The other was the insatiable hunger of the empire itself, a vast and powerful beast that demanded constant feeding. Tribute could not be delayed. The king's granaries had to be filled to provision his armies, to feed the lavish courts of Gao and Timbuktu, and to display the immense wealth and power of Songhai to visiting dignitaries and foreign merchants. This obligation was woven into the very fabric of daily life, even into the sacred rituals of farming. At harvest time, the first sheaves cut from the field were often set aside, not for the farmer's family, nor for the ancestors as an offering of thanks, but for the tribute basket. This simple act was a constant, potent reminder to all who labored under the hot sun that their sweat, their toil, their very sustenance did not belong solely to them. It belonged, in part, to the empire. There were stories told, passed down from one generation to the next, of years when the weight of tribute nearly broke entire villages. There were years when floods washed away the fields, leaving nothing but mud and devastation, and yet the collectors still came. There were years when drought cracked the soil into a mosaic of dust, and yet the demands from the capital did not lessen. In those desperate times, families banded together, pooling what little they had, a handful of grain here, a few yams, there to avoid the brutal punishments that followed refusal. It was not unheard of for a farmer to sell his only cow, a creature as dear as a family member, or even to trade a child's labor into bonded service, all just to pay the year's due and survive until the next planting season. Tribute was the ultimate reminder that no matter how hard the farmer bent his back in the fields, from the first light of dawn to the last ray of dusk, he was never truly free. His harvest was always shared, sometimes willingly, as a sign of loyalty, but often by force. And so, as much as he feared the unpredictable river and the unforgiving sky, he also learned to fear the shadow of authority that fell. Across his field, the shadow of a man who came not to help, but to take. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and we rest beneath the stars. This constant burden of tribute profoundly shaped the farmer's view of the world, his understanding of justice, fairness, and power. Some elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of many seasons, would say it was the price of belonging to a mighty empire, the cost of the security and order that the king provided. Others, their voices low and tinged with sorrow, would call it a yoke too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear. But for the farmer himself, there was no choice. He could not debate the philosophy of governance. He had to survive. Each season began with a seed of hope, a prayer for rain. It was filled with grueling toil, and it concluded almost inevitably, with the firm knocking on his door, the steady, rhythmic reminder that his life was woven not just into the soil beneath his feet, but into the grand, unforgiving machinery of the empire itself. In the heart of West Africa, across the sprawling plains of Houseland, the earth tells a story. It's a story written not in ink, but in sweat, soil, and the ceaseless rhythm of the seasons. For generations, these farmlands were more than just fields of grain. They were a vast stage where families acted out a timeless script of labor, hope, and exhaustion. Imagine the soil, rich and dark, drinking in the life-giving rains of the wet season, only to crack and harden under the relentless command of the sun. For the Hausa farmer, life was dictated by this very land. They rose at dawn, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The land demanded their attention, and hunger was a swift and cruel punishment for any delay. This wasn't a job with set hours. It was a pact with the earth, renewed each day before the first light broke the horizon. Every harvest brought with it a wave of relief, a collective exhale across the land. The calabashes would fill with millet and sorghum, a tangible reward for months of back-breaking work. But this relief was always fleeting, as temporary as a morning mist. Soon after the grains were gathered, the tribute collectors would arrive, their presence a stark reminder of power and obligation. Merchants, ever opportunistic, would press their advantage, buying low when supply was high. And so, the family granary, which had seemed so full just weeks before, would begin to shrink, its contents dwindling before the dry, dusty winds of the Harmattan season had even fully arrived. To work this land was to be caught in a perpetual circle, walking round and round, a journey of immense effort that always seemed to lead back to the beginning. It was a cycle of abundance and scarcity, of fulfillment and loss, etched into the very soul of the people. The Hausa farmer measured time differently. Not in years, not in months, but in seasons of toil. There was the planting, a time of hope and sore muscles, as seeds were carefully placed into the waiting earth. Then came the weeding, a constant battle against stubborn intruders that threatened the precious crops. This was followed by the harvest, a period of intense, communal effort under the hot sun. And finally, there was the long, anxious wait, the dread of scarcity that hung in the air during the dry season. Sweat was the currency of this existence, falling into the soil like a sacred offering, as if feeding the land with the very essence of human life. A child born during the planting season would grow old to this same rhythm. Their back would learn to bend under the same sun that had tanned their grandfather's skin. Their dreams and aspirations inextricably tied to the stubborn, unyielding earth. It was a life of profound connection to the land, a connection forged in hardship and resilience. What makes this relentless cycle so poignant is that it was not the burden of a single farmer or one isolated family. It was a collective inheritance, a story shared by millions. It was a weight and a wisdom passed down through generations. Grandfathers, their hands gnarled and their faces lined like the cracked earth itself, would whisper to their grandsons that this hardship was the fundamental rhythm of existence. They taught them that to wrestle with the soil was to wrestle with destiny itself. This wasn't a philosophy of despair, but one of profound realism and endurance. The oral traditions, the stories told around evening fires, were filled with tales of seasons when the rains failed and famine cast a dark shadow over the land. These weren't just cautionary tales. They were chronicles of survival. They spoke of how the people endured, how they held on, and how, when the first rains of the next season finally came, they planted once more, placing their trust back into the very soil that had previously betrayed them, hoping it might be kinder this time. Think of it. An old farmer's hands, weathered and wise, carefully sowing seeds into a furrow. Then, in a blink of an eye, those hands dissolve into the younger, stronger hands of his grandson, performing the exact same act in the same field decades later. This single image captures the essence of this inherited struggle. It's a powerful testament to the continuity of life and labor in Hausland. This cycle was the bedrock of their society. It shaped their worldview, their social structures, and their very identity. The village chief, the blacksmith, the weaver all were ultimately dependent on the farmer's success. When the harvest was good, the entire community thrived. When it failed, everyone felt the pangs of hunger. This shared vulnerability created a deep sense of interdependence and community, a recognition that they were all in this together, bound by the whims of the sun and the rain. In this unending cycle, there was both despair and a profound dignity. The despair came from the sheer relentlessness of the labor and the constant threat of scarcity. It was the quiet ache in a farmer's bones at the end of a long day, the worry in a mother's eyes as she measured out the grain. But the dignity was just as real. It was found in the act of providing for one's family against all odds. It was in the deep knowledge of the land, understanding its secrets and its moods. The sweat of countless lives fertilized not only the fields of sorghum and millet, but also the cultural memory of perseverance. It watered the roots of a culture that learned to bend but not break. The Hausa farmer knew, with an instinct born of generations of experience, that the wealth built in distant palaces or accumulated through bustling trade routes could fade. Empires could rise and fall, caravans could be lost to the desert, but the soil demanding, unyielding, and eternal always remained. It would always be there, asking for more, demanding their strength, their sweat, their hope. This cycle was the great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were from a powerful family or a humble one. The sun beat down on everyone, and the rains, when they came, fell on all fields alike. This shared experience created a unique social fabric. It fostered a culture of mutual support, where neighbors would help each other during the harvest, and communities would share resources during lean times. Proverbs and songs celebrated the virtues of hard work, patience, and cooperation. These weren't just quaint folk sayings. They were survival guides, distilled wisdom passed down to help navigate the challenges of their world. The endless cycle of soil and sweat was, therefore, much more than a simple metaphor for hardship. It was the very pulse of life itself. It was the heartbeat of a society, a rhythm that set the foundation for Hausa culture, its epic struggles, and its stubborn, remarkable survival against the odds. Imagine a slow pan across a field of golden millet, the stalks swaying gently in the wind, looking like a sea of gold under the afternoon sun. It's a beautiful, peaceful image. But then, superimposed over this scene, a ghostly overlay of tired faces appears, the faces of men, women, and even children, their backs bent in the timeless posture of the harvest. This juxtaposition of beauty and struggle is the core of the Hausa farmer's story. It is a story of finding grace in the grind, of nurturing life from a land that often seemed determined to withhold it. The farmer's relationship with the land was complex, a dance of conflict and codependence. They fought it, they cursed it, but they also loved it and revered it. It was the source of their greatest anxieties and their most profound joys. It was the canvas upon which the entire epic of their existence was painted. A story that continues to resonate in the soil of Hausland today. The soil of Songhai was never a gentle partner. Farmers bent their backs into it, and when the sun burned the land dry, or when the floods swelled too wide, it gave back little in return. Yet, behind this hard labor, There was also an invisible order, a system that decided who tilled where, who owed what, and who held authority over the harvest. This was not just farming. It was farming bound by law, by tribute, and by the will of empire. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and we rest beneath the stars. In many villages along the Niger River, land was divided under the watchful eyes of elders or chiefs. Each family received strips of fertile ground, but not all land was equal. The closer you were to the river, the richer the soil. Those farther away bore the burden of drier, hungrier earth. Chiefs were tasked with allocating plots, but behind their decisions lay politics. Loyalty, tribute, obligations, and alliances. To farm was to live under constant negotiation. Your hoe cut the ground, but another hand shaped your fate. Labor was just as carefully organized. Farming in Songhai was rarely a solitary act. Fields were cleared by communal work gangs. Relatives, neighbors, and bonded laborers all moved in rhythm, guided by drums or chants, turning back-breaking labor into a shared performance of survival. Yet, alongside kin-based groups worked slaves captured in war or debtors forced into servitude. Their sweat mingled with the free farmer's sweat, but their futures were far less certain. For them, each stroke of the hoe was done for another man's harvest. Let's pause here for a moment. The wind shifts through the tall grasses, and the night grows deeper. Over all this labor hovered the law, not written on parchment, but carried in memory, spoken in village councils, enforced by chiefs and their messengers. Rules dictated when you could plant, what share of your millet or rice must be sent as tribute, and who claimed ownership when disputes arose. The Songhai Empire depended on these laws. Fields were not just about food, they were about order, control, and the unbroken rhythm of power flowing from the smallest farmer to the throne of Gao. As the empire grew, land disputes became more complex. Families fought over boundaries. Villagers accused chiefs of favoritism. Warriors demanded plots as reward for service. And above it all, tribute collectors arrived, weighing baskets of grain to send to the royal storehouses. For the farmer, the field was no longer just earth beneath his hands. It was a stage where power, law, and survival played out with every harvest. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and distant drums echo from another village. This intricate system, where every grain of rice had a purpose beyond just feeding a family, was the bedrock of Songhai's power. It was a world built on cooperation, but also on obligation. The same river that gave life also carried away tribute. The same hands that sowed seeds also built an empire. Thank you for journeying with me tonight. When Askia Muhammad rose to power in the late 15th century, he didn't just inherit an empire of warriors and traders. He inherited an empire of farmers. He understood a fundamental truth. The soil was both the empire's lifeline and its greatest weakness. Floods could drown the fields, and droughts could starve them. The tribute system could fill the coffers in Gao, but if pushed too hard, it could ruin the very villages that sustained the empire. So Askia, the great general, turned his sharp mind to the land itself, to the soil that fed his armies, his courts, and his grand dreams of an empire. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine us sitting here, the fire crackling softly, the shadows of the great baobab tree stretching long and thin as the sun sets. This is a story about more than just history. It's about the earth beneath our feet. Askia's genius wasn't confined to the battlefield. It shone brightest in administration. He launched ambitious irrigation projects all along the Niger River, carving new canals to channel water into the thirsty rice fields and to tame the river's wild seasonal floods. Rice, especially down in the lower Niger Valley, became the crown jewel of Songhai's agriculture. These fields, nourished by a network of dikes and channels, transformed into massive storehouses capable of feeding thousands upon thousands. Askia knew that a hungry empire cannot march, it cannot trade, and it certainly cannot rule. In his hands, the farmer's hoe became as mighty as the warrior's spear. But his policies went beyond just managing water. Askia Muhammad also completely reorganized land rights and the tribute system. He standardized who paid what, creating a system to ensure the empire's granaries were always full. But without stripping villages bare in the process, imperial inspectors would travel the vast countryside, meticulously counting fields, weighing the harvests, and reporting everything back to the capital. For the first time, tribute became predictable, a far cry from the chaotic and often brutal collections of the past. It was still a heavy burden, of course, for those at the bottom of the social ladder. But now, the peasants' sweat flowed through a system designed not by chance, but by royal decree. Let's take another moment here. The night air is growing cooler now, and if you look up, you can see the stars beginning to shimmer like silent, ancient witnesses to this story. This new sense of order extended beyond just food production. Askia ingeniously tied farming to religion and scholarship. He would regularly consult with Islamic scholars on questions of fairness in taxation, grounding his reforms not just in imperial law, but also in faith. Farming was elevated. It became more than just physical toil. It was a moral duty woven into the very fabric of the empire's identity as a powerful Islamic state. To farm was to feed the people, and to feed the people was to serve both God and the ruler. The neat rows of millet and rice became like lines in a greater, living scripture of empire. And yet, for all their brilliance, even Askia's reforms couldn't erase the fundamental hardships of a farmer's life. Canals would break during powerful floods. Pests could ravage an entire season's crop in a matter of days. And the weight of tribute, no matter how predictable, was always heavy. You can almost hear the farmers whispering among themselves, saying that no matter how fair the law claimed to be, the earth always demanded sweat, and the rulers always demanded grain. Still, Askia's policies left an indelible mark. For a generation, Songhai's granaries were full, and its empire swelled with a newfound strength and stability. The fields themselves became a reflection of the empire, both a battlefield against nature and a blessing from it, shaped by policy as much as they were by the rain. Let's pause one last time. The fire has dimmed to glowing embers now, and in the distance, the lonely call of an owl cuts through the quiet of the night. These agricultural reforms were the bedrock of Askia's golden age. They stabilized the food supply, fueled the economy, and allowed the empire to project its power across West Africa. The wealth from the fields supported the grand mosques of Timbuktu and the bustling markets of Gap. It funded the scholars, the artists, and the armies that made Songhai a name whispered with awe across the known world. The story of Songhai is often told through its gold and its scholars, but it was written, line by line, in the mud and water of the Niger's rice paddies. The legacy of Askia Muhammad isn't just in the monuments he built, but in the harvests his policies secured for his people. If you stood in a Songhai field at dawn, the soil would tell you a story not of one crop, but of many. Millet, sorghum, rice, each seed was a gamble, each stalk a prayer against an unforgiving sky. The genius of the Songhai farmer wasn't just in their sweat and strength, but in their wisdom, knowing which grain could defy which season. This agricultural diversity was no happy accident. It was the very essence of survival, a strategy born from centuries of watching the Niger River rise and fall, of learning its rhythms and moods. Imagine standing there as the first light breaks. The air is still cool, the earth is damp. You can almost hear the soft hum of the wind rustling through tall grasses, a gentle sigh before the day's heat arrives. It's in this quiet moment that the deep connection between the people and the land becomes clear. This wasn't just farming. It was a conversation with nature itself. Millet was the old, faithful companion. It was resilient, a survivor. It thrived in places where the rains were stingy, holding onto its precious grain against the scorching drought like a miser guarding their last coins. Sorghum was its taller, stronger brother, with its distinct reddish head. It stood defiant against pests and offered sustenance even when the sky was cruel and offered little else. But rice, rice was the jewel in the crown. Along the vast floodplains of the Niger River, the rice paddies spread out like lush, green carpets. Here, the river dictated everything. The rise and retreat of the water wrote the agricultural calendar, and the farmers learned to read its moods as carefully as scholars read ancient manuscripts. They knew precisely when to plant, when to flood, and when to harvest, guided by generations of accumulated knowledge. Together, these three crops formed a powerful shield against the constant threat of famine. It was a brilliantly calculated balance of risk. If the rains failed and the millet struggled, perhaps the sorghum would endure. If pests attacked one crop, the others might be spared. It was a diversified portfolio of survival, ensuring that no single disaster could wipe out their entire food supply. This wasn't just about planting seeds. It was about planting hope in multiple forms, ensuring the community would always have something to fall back on. This diversity wasn't just a practical strategy. It was woven into the very fabric of their spiritual beliefs. The farmers whispered that each crop possessed its own spirit. Millet was seen as patient and enduring. Sorghum was fierce and protective. Rice was generous and abundant. Before a single seed was placed in the earth, rituals were performed. Libations of water or milk were poured onto the ground. Offerings made to the ancestors to ask for their blessing, to ensure the earth would receive the seed kindly and nurture it to life. These crops weren't just inanimate sources of food. They were part of a living, spiritual economy. A successful harvest depended as much on showing respect for the land and the spirits as it did on the rain and the sun. To fail in performing the proper rituals was to invite blight, disease, or a poor yield. But to honor the traditions, to show gratitude, was to welcome a season of bounty. This spiritual dimension gave their hard labor a profound sense of purpose and connection to the world around them. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the day's work is done. The fire hums low, casting a warm glow. As you look up, the stars seem brighter, closer, shining down on a world that feels both ancient and alive. In the quiet, you can feel the weight of these beliefs. The deep reverence for the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that plays out in the fields every year. This agricultural variety also shaped the empire's trade. Millet and sorghum were the staples that fed the heartlands, the everyday sustenance for countless villages and towns. But rice, being more labor-intensive and geographically restricted, often became a valuable commodity. It traveled along the river and overland trade routes, sometimes reaching markets far beyond the floodplains where it was grown. Each grain had its own journey, its own value, and its own place in building the immense wealth of the Songhai Empire. When the great caravans departed from bustling cities like Gao or Timbuktu, they were famously loaded with salt from the north, shimmering gold from the south, and bolts of fine cloth. But beneath all these visible luxuries, supporting the entire magnificent structure of the empire, was the quiet, unassuming backbone of grain. The empire's splendor, its armies, its scholars, its grand mosques, all of it rested on the bounty of fields tilled by calloused hands, on seeds sown with a mixture of hope, prayer, and incredible endurance. And so, the life of a Songhai farmer was a masterpiece of ingenuity forged in hardship. Where an outsider might see only dry soil and grueling labor, the Songhai people crafted resilience from diversity. They didn't farm with the luxury of certainty. Instead, they farmed with a strategy of layered bets, planting 3 different answers to the single, terrifying question of survival. They offered 3 distinct prayers to one unpredictable sky. Their fields were like a beautifully woven cloth. The threads of millet, sorghum, and rice were bound tightly together, creating a fabric strong enough to face the unpredictable challenges of flood, drought, and the demands of tribute to a powerful empire. It was a system of quiet genius, a testament to their deep understanding of the land and their unwavering will to thrive. Let's pause one last time. The night is deep now. The fire has dwindled to glowing embers, and a profound silence has fallen, a silence that carries the memory of countless harvests, of generations of farmers who worked this very land. In this stillness, you can feel the enduring legacy of the Songhai people, a legacy not just of gold and empires, but of the simple, powerful wisdom of the grain. In the vast fields of the Songhai Empire, the story of survival wasn't written in stone, but in grain. Millet and sorghum stood as the twin guardians of life, their roots sunk deep into the uncertain soil of the savannah. To understand Songhai is to understand this fundamental truth. An empire is built not just on armies and trade, but on the food that sustains its people. When the rains arrived on time, millet, with its small golden seeds, flourished. But when the rains faltered, betrayed the hopes of the farmer, the sturdy sorghum stood tall, a bastion against drought. For the people who tilled this land, these grains weren't merely crops. They were partners in a timeless, unending dance with the sky. Imagine for a moment, the fire whispers low, and the stars draw nearer in their quiet, watchful circle. Millet was beloved for its resilience and its speed. It grew quickly, a blessing in a land where time was measured in seasons of want and plenty. It filled households with nourishing porridge and thickened hearty sauces, bringing warmth and sustenance to countless families. Sorghum, with its distinctive red heads and tough stalks, was the steadfast elder. It resisted pests, it endured the scorching heat, and it weathered the fickle moods of the climate. Together, they created a rhythm, a strategy for survival. Millet was the quick, hopeful step in the dance, while sorghum provided the steady, reliable drumbeat. If one harvest failed, the other might just endure. This wasn't just farming. It was a testament to wisdom, a knowledge passed down through generations, a balance that spoke of a deep understanding of their world. Yet, these vital crops were never planted without a sense of reverence. The act of farming was woven into the spiritual fabric of Songhai society. Before scattering the precious seeds, offerings might be made. A farmer might pour a libation of millet beer or place kola nuts upon the earth, a gesture of respect and a request for blessing. They would whisper invocations to their ancestors, seeking guidance on the perfect moment to sow, the right time to pray for the life-giving rains. Every planting was a ritual, a sacred act connecting the living to the world of spirits and the earth itself. and every harvest was a thanksgiving, a celebration of life renewed. The grain was more than just sustenance. It was spirit, binding families and communities together in endless cycles of respect and reciprocity. Let's pause again. The fire crackles softly now, and a cool breeze passes, carrying the faint, hopeful scent of distant rain. To an outsider, someone just passing through, millet and sorghum might have appeared as simple, humble food. But to the Songhai, they were the lifelines stitched into the very fabric of their empire. Without the quiet, unassuming endurance of these grains, the powerful armies of Askia Muhammad would have marched on empty stomachs, their strength sapped before ever reaching the battlefield. The renowned scholars of Timbuktu, whose wisdom illuminated West Africa, would have written their manuscripts with minds clouded by hunger. The bustling markets that lined the great Niger River, centers of commerce and culture, would have fallen silent, their stalls empty. In Songhai, grain was power. It was a quiet and often invisible force, but its influence was absolute, undeniable, and so, season after season, the Songhai farmer placed their hope into the earth, one seed at a time. They trusted that this powerful duet of millet and sorghum, working in harmony, could outlast the unpredictable moods of the sky. Each harvest was a delicate negotiation with nature, a prayer answered not in words, but in stalks, heavy with grain. This wasn't farming for profit in the modern sense. It was farming for life itself, for the continuation of family, community, and empire. It was the ancient, sacred duet of seed and sky, a story of resilience that continues to echo across the savannah. As the night deepens, the fire glows steady, holding the silence and the wisdom of generations. For the Songhai people, the Niger River wasn't just a body of water. It was a living artery, a golden thread stitched through the very fabric of their empire, connecting villages, fields, and the heartbeat of daily life. And where its powerful currents slowed, where its banks widened into shimmering, fertile marshlands, a special crop became both a divine gift and a constant challenge. Rice. Think about it. Crops like millet or sorghum were relatively straightforward. They could thrive on the higher ground, content with the seasonal rains. But rice was different. Rice was demanding. It asked for a deep understanding, for patience, for a constant, delicate negotiation with the moods of the great river. In many ways, cultivating rice was a perfect mirror of the Songhai state itself, vast, intricate, and utterly reliant on rhythm, yet always vulnerable to sudden disruption. An emperor in his grand palace in Gao, or a scholar in the libraries of Timbuktu, might command armies and trade routes, but they couldn't command rice into existence. They had to listen to the water. They had to respect its power. A farmer, standing ankle-deep in the rich mud of the riverbank, understood a fundamental truth of the empire. Power here wasn't absolute. It was conditional, borrowed from the will of the river. To plant rice was to become a reader of signs written in water and sky. The farmers, men and women alike, would watch the river swell during the rainy season. They'd wait, with centuries of accumulated knowledge, for that precise moment when the floodwaters began to settle, leaving behind a nutrient-rich blanket of silt. Then the work would begin. It was a communal dance. They moved in groups, staking out the shallow paddies, their feet sinking into mud that smelled of the earth, of fish, and of new life. They would build low earthen walls, called bundas, to carefully trap and manage the water, transforming the vast floodplain into a breathtaking patchwork of glistening mirrors reflecting the immense African sky. In those crucial weeks, the entire community labored as one. The elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of seasons past, would advise on the water's subtle flows. The youths, full of energy, would trample the mud to the perfect consistency, and the women would scatter the precious seeds with gestures that were part duty, part prayer, entrusting their future to the soil and the water. Rice cultivation turned the landscape into a living dialogue between human order and the wild forces of nature. It was an incredibly delicate balance. If there was too little water, the tender green seedlings would wither and die under the intense sun. But if there was too much, a sudden surge in the flood, the young plants would drown, lost beneath the very water that was meant to give them life. The farmers' hands had to become instruments of balance. Day after day, they would be out in the fields, opening small channels to let more water in, closing others to drain excess away. They were guiding the river's abundance, channeling its life-giving power, but they could never fully control it. This constant, delicate dance meant that rice was simultaneously the most treasured and the most precarious of all the Songhai-esque grains. The wealth that rice brought wasn't just measured in full bellies. It carried immense prestige. A household or a lineage that successfully cultivated rice was signaling something important, that they commanded enough labor and knowledge to tame the water and the soil. Chiefs and local rulers who controlled the fertile river valleys often demanded rice as tribute. They knew that a bountiful rice harvest revealed not only the fertility of the land, but also the discipline and unity of its people. Imagine the scene, a procession approaching a ruler's court, not with gold or salt, but with beautifully woven baskets brimming with polished rice grains. It was a powerful statement. To present these baskets was to say, "We have mastered the river, we have worked in harmony with its power, and we honor you with its most precious gifts." But this wealth was fragile. Unlike millet, which could be stored for many seasons in tall, dry clay granaries, rice was ephemeral. It spoiled easily. It demanded constant care even after the harvest. It had to be dried carefully under the sun, husked with heavy wooden pestles in a rhythmic, percussive beat, and constantly guarded against moisture and rot. This impermanence made rice both a luxury and a high-stakes gamble. Oral traditions and stories, passed down through generations, recall how one year's incredible abundance could vanish in a moment. A mistimed flood, a sudden drought, or an infestation of insects could wipe out a season's hard work. A family that was rich in rice one season could find themselves desperately bargaining for millet the next. In this way, the grain itself became a powerful metaphor for the shifting fortunes of life, a reminder that power and wealth, much like the river's water, could rise and retreat without any warning. The relationship with rice went deeper than just agriculture. It was woven into the spiritual fabric of Songhai society. Communities told stories that tied the grain directly to the spirits of the river. Some believed that rice would only grow with the blessing of unseen beings who dwelled in the swirling whirlpools or hid among the reeds along the banks. The songs sung in the paddies were more than just work songs to pass the time. They were invocations, soft chants and prayers offered to these water spirits. The farmers would ask them to steady the floods, to protect the fields from pests, and to grant a generous harvest. For the Songhai, farming was never just physical labor. It was a ritual. To plant rice without prayer, without acknowledging the forces that governed the unseen world, was to risk not only hunger but also the wrath of the spirits. At the same time, this special grain connected the Songhai to a much wider world. Rice wasn't native to every part of the empire. It had traveled over centuries. Different varieties had made their way along trade routes and rivers. From the banks of the Senegal River, from ancient centers of cultivation in the inland delta, and through exchanges with traders who carried both African and Asian types of rice. By the height of the Songhai Empire, rice had become a marker of a cosmopolitan, interconnected life along the Niger. In the bustling, vibrant markets of Timbuktu and Jenpuk, you would find sacks of locally grown rice sitting alongside massive salt slabs from the Sahara, gold dust from the southern forests, and fine cloth from North Africa and Europe. It was a local treasure that had a place on the global stage. And yet, through all this, that delicate balance remained the central theme. Rice was a blessing that demanded humility. It made the farmers attentive, forcing them to bend their bodies to the will of the water, and the soil in a cycle that was endless. It made the chiefs and emperors cautious, knowing that the tribute collected in rice was never guaranteed, that their wealth was tied to the river's whims. And it made the empire itself profoundly aware that its greatness did not just rest on the strength of its armies or the wealth of its trade routes. It rested on something far more fundamental: the patient, daily labor of ordinary men and women, standing knee-deep in flooded fields, working in partnership with the great river. The memory of rice in the Songhai world is a story of fragility, resilience, and deep reverence. It is a powerful tale of how an empire's survival and its magnificent wealth were tied not just to human ambition, but to the natural rhythms of the river, balance as thin, as precious, and as beautiful as the grain of rice itself. In the Songhai world, farming was never just toil in the soil. It was a sacred ritual, a cycle of gestures and words, meant to align human hands with the unseen forces believed to govern the land. While the empire's power rested on armies, trade, and tribute, its very soul was rooted in the rituals of those who coaxed grain from the earth. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were acts that blurred the line between labor and worship. Millet, sorghum, and rice weren't just food. They were living bridges connecting human communities to the spirits of the rain, the river, and the soil itself. To handle seeds was to handle destiny. To treat the land carelessly was to risk angering the powers that could give or withhold life. The farmer's field was more than an economic unit or a family's lifeline. It was a sacred stage where the drama of fertility, mortality, and renewal unfolded year after year. Much of this work was guided by song. As men broke the earth with their hoes, rhythmic chants would echo across the fields, synchronizing muscle with melody. The beat of the song wasn't just for coordination. It carried memory. Verses recalled the ancestors who first cleared the land, the spirits who dwelled within the soil, and the ancient bargains made for rain. Women, too, carried their own songs, lullabies, woven with invocations, sung as they sowed or harvested, as if to remind the crops that they were nurtured by both hands and voices. Among the Songhai, it was believed that spirits inhabited nearly every aspect of the landscape. Sacred groves marked places where ancestors were said to dwell. Solitary trees standing in fields were often left untouched, thought to shelter protective beings. The great river, the empire's lifeline, was home to deities whose moods could decide whether harvests flourished or failed. Because of this, farming was layered with rituals designed to honor, appease, and persuade these powerful forces. Offerings of millet beer, cola nuts, or small livestock might be made at the start of planting, signaling both gratitude and a humble request for favor. What might seem to outsiders like simple agricultural routine was, in Songhai memory, a deeply spiritual choreography. Even the timing of planting was debated not only in terms of the coming rains, but also in alignment with celestial signs, the rising of certain stars, or the phases of the moon. Oral traditions tell us that priests, diviners, and elders often held the final authority, declaring when the sowing could begin. It was a beautiful fusion of cosmology with the most practical of human labor. Harvest time was just as ceremonial. The first fruits of the harvest were often withheld from immediate consumption, dedicated instead to community rituals. In some villages, the very first sheaf of millet cut from the field was tied and offered to ancestral shrines. This powerful act symbolized continuity, a recognition that the grain was not just a product of present labor, but a gift sustained by generations of spirit allies. Festivals tied to the harvest-filled villages with drumming, dancing, and storytelling moments when exhaustion gave way to celebration, and the entire community partook in the wealth of the earth. This blending of ritual and farming extended deep into the social fabric of the empire. Fields weren't simply divided by family inheritance. They were tied to intricate networks of obligation and reciprocity. Lending labor during planting or harvest bound families together, creating webs of trust that carried a spiritual weight. To refuse to help a neighbor in their fields was not just a social slight, it was seen as a breach of moral duty, a disruption of the communal balance that the spirits themselves were thought to observe. Stories tied to these practices often blurred the line between myth and memory. Tales were told of spirits disguised as beggars who would visit farms to test the generosity of the families living there. A refusal to share grain could bring misfortune, while hospitality could ensure abundance for seasons to come. These narratives reinforced a moral economy where farming wasn't just about producing food, but about sustaining a cosmic order. Justice, generosity, and ritual care were what truly determined the fate of the harvest. Even the bustling marketplace absorbed these spiritual rhythms. Grain sold in the stalls was not only weighed and traded, but often accompanied by quiet gestures of blessing. A merchant might sprinkle a little water on their baskets of millet or rice, a symbolic act to cool the anger of spirits who might resent the grain being separated from its soil. A buyer might whisper a quiet word of thanks to their ancestors before carrying their purchase home. Every transaction was thus doubled, economic on the surface, but deeply ritualistic underneath. The Songhai Empire's immense strength depended on this very fusion of labor and ritual. Armies could march, rulers could tax, and traders could prosper. But if the rains failed, if the spirits were angered, or if the rituals were neglected, the fields would withhold their abundance. Oral histories often frame great famines not as mere climatic failures, but as consequences of a spiritual imbalance. The people remembered hunger not just as a loss of grain, but as a dire warning that human arrogance had offended the unseen order of the world. And yet, a profound resilience marked the Songhai farmer's spirit. Year after year, even after floods, droughts, or devastating invasions, they returned to the fields. Their songs rose once again as hoes struck the earth, and their rituals were renewed with each planting season. Farming, then, was an ultimate testament to faith in the soil, in the community, and in the invisible threads tying the living to their ancestors and to the divine. These rituals of farming were so much more than cultural flourishes. They were the empire's heartbeat. Without them, the grain might still grow, but it would be rootless, stripped of its meaning, detached from the moral and spiritual scaffolding that gave Songhai life its incredible depth. In the end, farming in the Songhai world was never just about survival. It was about belonging to the land, to the ancestors, and to a cosmos where every single seed carried both the cure for hunger and the immense weight of destiny. Beneath the wide Sahelian sky, where the mighty Niger River carved its path through Songhai lands, powerful families commanded not just the soil, but the very lives of those who tilled it. By the end of this journey, You'll understand how the land was more than a place to sow crops. It was a grand stage for power, prestige, and inherited authority. For generations, certain families held vast tracts of fertile fields, passing them down like precious heirlooms. These dynasties were not merely wealthy. They were the backbone of Songhai governance in the countryside. Their control over agricultural land ensured loyalty, created hierarchies, and determined who could feed their family and who would struggle under the weight of tribute. Farmers worked long hours, often under the relentless sun, yet it was the unseen hand of the landowning elite that dictated what would be planted, how it would be harvested, and the portion owed to the rulers above. These families did more than just supervise crops. They were the crucial political intermediaries between the emperor in Gao and the scattered villages dotting the river Edge. A son born into such a household learned from his earliest days to read the land, to interpret seasonal patterns, and to manage both human and natural resources. This instruction came not only from elders but through deeply embedded rituals, offerings made to spirits of fertility, ceremonies to bless the planting season, and the strict observance of communal customs. Each act of sowing and reaping became intertwined with the family's prestige and their perceived spiritual favor. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and we rest beneath the stars. Imagine the rhythmic pounding of mortar in village courtyards, the distant calls of herders, and the ever-present hum of the river threading its way through life. All of this unfolded under the watchful eyes of elite families, whose influence extended beyond the tangible wealth of their fields and into the shaping of the moral and social order. In practice, these dynasties were both guardians and governors. They mediated disputes, settled arguments over water rights, and maintained loyalty to the emperor through careful reporting and tribute collection. Yet, with such authority came the danger of overreach. Families with vast holdings could enforce heavy labor requirements on tenant farmers, dictate what was acceptable in terms of crop rotation, and even demand portions of the harvest as a token of obedience. For ordinary farmers, this power imbalance was an ever-present reality, shaping their routines, their ambitions, and their very understanding of what a day's labor was truly worth. Consider the social fabric of the villages. The head of a powerful family could convene elders to oversee planting schedules or to adjudicate disputes over shared irrigation channels. These meetings were more than just administrative. They were performances of authority, ceremonies of power that reminded everyone of the family's position in the hierarchy. While the emperor in Gao claimed ultimate sovereignty, it was these family dynasties who ensured that governance reached the soil and the seeds. Without them, the political machinery of Songhai agriculture would falter, and the fragile order along the Niger's banks might simply dissolve. Yet, the lives of these elites were not without their own challenges. The Songhai landscape could be unforgiving. Seasonal floods might destroy carefully tended fields. Droughts could reduce the harvest to a fraction of its normal yield. And political shifts in the capital could threaten privileges inherited over generations. Managing the land was as much about diplomacy and foresight as it was about direct supervision. These families constantly negotiated alliances with neighboring dynasties, maintained loyalty among their tenants, and balanced the spiritual expectations of their communities. In every ritual blessing, in every irrigation channel cleared, the weight of their legacy pressed down on them like the midday sun. Even in times of plenty, the dynasties reinforced their power through public displays. Grain stores were carefully arranged to demonstrate immense wealth. Ceremonial harvests involved grand offerings to local spirits, and prominent family members traveled to Gao to maintain their visibility in the imperial court. All of these acts were intertwined with agriculture, making every blade of millet, every stalk of sorghum, and every patch of rice a symbol of authority. The farmers saw this clearly. The land did not belong solely to them, but to a long chain of oversight extending from the village to the dynasty to the empire itself. By the time a young farmer learned the rhythm of planting and harvesting, the presence of these dynasties was etched into every single action. Decisions about what to sow, when to till, and how to distribute labor carried the invisible marks of authority. Even leisure, markets, and community celebrations were shaped by the landowning families, who orchestrated festivals, sponsored local prayers, and maintained their influence over economic life. The fields, once a simple symbol of survival, had become a stage where prestige and obligation played out with each and every harvest. The dynasty's influence also extended to education and the training of skilled farmers. The sons and daughters of tenant families might be assigned apprenticeships in advanced irrigation techniques or crop management, but always under the strict supervision of elite household members. Knowledge was controlled, passed on selectively, and used to reinforce the existing social hierarchies. Every seed planted and every yield collected carried both a physical and a symbolic weight, a constant reminder of how closely intertwined labor, loyalty, and lineage had become in the Songhai lands. Let's pause here again. The river's gentle murmur blends with distant drums. The scent of crushed millet in the fields rises on the evening air, and the sun dips low, casting a golden light across the fertile lands. In these moments, one can almost feel the invisible threads connecting the farmer to the family, to the empire complex network of power that bound the land as tightly as the roots of the crops themselves. In this way, family dynasties and political fields were inseparable. Land was more than sustenance. It was inheritance, authority, and legacy. The work of a farmer fed more than just bodicit, nourished the prestige of powerful households, and cemented the social order of an entire empire. To truly understand Songhai agriculture, one must see both the sweat on the brow of the farmer and the heavy weight of the dynasty that oversaw each and every furrow. Imagine the relentless sun of the Songhai heartland. For the farmers laboring beneath it, every day was a struggle, not just for their own survival, but under the invisible chains of tribute. In the next few minutes, we'll explore how every swing of the hoe, every seed planted, carried the weight of obligation to family dynasties, village chiefs, and the distant emperor in Gao. In the Songhai Empire, tribute was far more than a simple tax. It was a ritualized display of power. Farmers were required to give up a portion of their harvest millet, sorghum, rice, even vegetables from their garden to the landowning families who governed their villages. Think of it like this: your family's entire year of hard work, and a significant chunk of it doesn't belong to you. If you couldn't meet these quotas, the consequences were harsh. You could be fined, forced into extra labor, or even have your precious animals and tools seized. This burden wasn't just about numbers. It dictated what you planted, how your family worked, and where you stood in the social pecking order. Authority was a layered cake. At the bottom, local dynasties made the rules in the village, but the ultimate power rested with the emperor. Every so often, imperial inspectors or envoys would travel down the Niger River to check the books and make sure collections were going smoothly. For the farmers, these visits were filled with anxiety. A single miscalculation in your yield report, a few missing baskets of grain, could bring disaster not just to you, but to your entire household. It wasn't just the back-breaking labor that wore them down. It was the constant mental strain of staying compliant under these ever-watchful eyes. The daily routine was already a race against time to maximize output, But tribute added a whole new level of work. Farmers had to plant extra crops just to cover potential losses, work longer hours during the harvest to meet the quotas, and then undertake long journeys to deliver the produce. It created a relentless cycle where fatigue and fear were constant companions. Even after the sun dipped below the horizon and the river shimmered under the moonlight, the knowledge that debts were owed and that authority was always watching lingered like a shadow over the entire village. Let's just pause here for a moment. Can you hear it? The soft lapping of the Niger against the reeds. A distant drumbeat from the village, the earthy scent of drying grain on the cool evening air. These sensory details remind us that tribute wasn't some abstract economic policy. It was a living, breathing reality that shaped every heartbeat of rural life. Every meal shared and every festival celebrated, tribute was also a powerful social tool. The families who controlled the land could use these obligations to reinforce their status, demonstrating their power and securing the loyalty of those beneath them. The interactions between farmers and authorities became highly ceremonial. The way the grains were presented, the timing of the delivery, the respectful presence of village elders, all of it was a carefully choreographed performance of deference. Tribute wasn't just about food. It was about communicating who held the power and who labored under it. The economic pressure of tribute had subtle but profound psychological effects. Farmers were in a constant state of risk assessment. If a flood wiped out part of the fields, could they still meet the quota? If a drought or a plague of locusts hit, would they be indebted for years to come? This constant vigilance shaped the entire village culture, fostering both incredible ingenuity and simmering tension. The oral histories of the Songhai are filled with stories of those who overpromised, those who tried to hide a poor harvest, and the dire consequences they faced. In the memory of the Songhai people, tribute was as much a moral and social test as it was an economic one. And yet, there was a deep sense of ritual woven into the collection of tribute. Delivering the harvest was often accompanied by prayers to ancestral spirits, offerings to the river god, and a communal acknowledgement of the emperor's divine mandate. These acts helped to soften the harshness of the obligation, embedding it within a familiar cultural and spiritual framework. In this way, tribute wasn't just a payment. It was a reaffirmation of social order, an expression of loyalty, and a way to maintain cosmic balance. The influence of authority even extended to the very basics of farming. Landowning dynasties often dictated what crops to plant, insisting on grains that were valuable to the empire. They set communal schedules for planting and harvesting, and everyone had to adhere to them. To fail was not just an agricultural mistake. It could be interpreted as defiance, negligence, or even a sign of spiritual imbalance. Every single act in the field, from tilling the soil to pulling the weeds, became both a form of work and a political statement, reflecting the deeply embedded power structures of Songhai society. Let's pause again. The night has settled over the fields, fireflies flicker like tiny stars over the millet stalks, and the river murmurs its ancient song. In these quiet moments, you can almost feel those invisible chains, the intricate web of obligations that linked the individual farmer to his family, his village, and the vast empire. The shadow of authority loomed even over moments of rest and celebration. Festivals and community gatherings were often scheduled around tribute deadlines, ensuring that even leisure time reinforced the social hierarchy. The education of the next generation was also shaped by these obligations. Children didn't just learn the practical skills of farming. They learned the subtler, more important lessons of loyalty, hierarchy, and obedience. In this sense, Tribute was both a heavy burden and a powerful teacher, instilling the rhythm of the empire into the very soul of every villager. So you see, in this intricate system, the farmers' chains were never just material. They were social, political, and spiritual. Labor, allegiance, and ritual were all intertwined, creating a world where survival depended as much on social cunning and cultural knowledge as it did on sheer physical endurance. Tribute was the thread that bound communities together, even as it asserted power all the way from the humble village to the magnificent imperial court in Gao. By the time the harvest season finally ended, the dual pressures of relentless work and heavy tribute were etched into every farmer's body and spirit. Yet, it was precisely this cycle of sowing, of tribute, of ritual, and of obedience that sustained the entire Songhai society. It fed the empire and the family. It produced immense wealth for the ruling dynasties, and it forged an unbreakable link between the earth and authority. Even as the great Niger River nourished the fields and the seasonal rains brought life to the millet and sorghum, not all who worked the land reaped its full benefits. The Songhai Empire, for all its glory, was a complex tapestry of wealth and deprivation. The fruits of labor often flowed upward, enriching dynastic families and imperial authorities, leaving the farmers to witness both the land's prosperity and the stark inequalities within their own communities. By the end of this part, you'll understand how these social hierarchies dictated the distribution of resources, shaping every aspect of life from dawn until dusk. Large estates and the most fertile lands were controlled by elite families, whose wealth and power far exceeded that of the common farmer. These landowners were the de facto rulers of village life. They collected tribute in the form of grain, allocated labor for planting and harvesting, and even adjudicated disputes among the villagers. While farmers toiled under the hot sun, the produce of their labor fed not only their own families, but also the lavish palace kitchens and bustling regional markets, generating wealth that reinforced the prestige and power of the dynasty. This contrast between laborers and landowners wasn't just economic, it was visible in their clothing, the quality of their homes, and the elaborate ceremonies that marked village life. This inequality even extended into the spiritual realm. It was common for landowners to control sacred spaces, lead important rituals, and oversee religious instruction, effectively intertwining their earthly power with a divine mandate. The farmers' labor and their offerings of grain were therefore essential, not just for material sustenance, but for maintaining what was seen as the cosmic and social balance of the world. This fusion of economic and spiritual authority cemented the high status of the elites, while subtly but constantly reminding the workers of their designated place within the social hierarchy. The concentration of wealth profoundly shaped daily routines, while the noble households enjoyed leisure time, planned market expeditions, or engaged in diplomacy. Farmers faced grueling work days. They often had to perform supplementary labor just to meet their tribute quotas, and lived with the constant vigilance needed to avoid fines or other punishments for failing to do so. Wealth inequality dictated more than just access to material comforts. It influenced social mobility, marriage prospects, and the education of the next generation. The children of elite families received tutoring in administration, diplomacy, and ritual practice, preparing them to rule. In contrast, the children of farmers inherited the rhythm of toil, learning from a young age the delicate balance between obedience and survival. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the Niger glimmering quietly under the moonlight, a gentle wind rustling the tall millet stalks, and the steady hum of evening insects filling the air. In this profound stillness, you can almost feel the unseen boundaries, the lines drawn between wealth and labor, authority and obligation. They seem as tangible and as real as the river itself. This economic disparity also created a massive difference in how people managed risk. For farmers, there was virtually no room for error. A sudden flood, a prolonged drought, an infestation of pests, or a wave of disease could devastate their crops. Yet, their obligations to the landowners and the imperial authorities remained constant. The elite, on the other hand, could easily buffer themselves against such crises. They stored surplus grain in vast granaries, could afford to hire extra labor, or simply redirect resources from their other estates. The gulf between those who produced the empire's wealth and those who controlled it was reinforced by geography, by access to resources, and by the institutionalized authority they held. Political power was similarly concentrated. These elite families leveraged their immense resources to secure loyalty from village officials, allowing them to manipulate tribute collection and maintain their influence at the regional courts. Farmers, while absolutely essential to the empire's sustenance and tax revenues, had little to no voice in governance. Social rituals, festivals, and even the dissemination of agricultural advice were often mediated by the very people who commanded the land and its resources. Inequality wasn't just a fact of life. It was codified in law, reinforced by ritual, and woven into the customs of daily life, embedding it deep into the fabric of rural society. Yet, even within this rigid structure, farmers found ways to assert a subtle agency. Their deep, intimate knowledge of crop rotation, local weather patterns, and the river's behavior allowed them to optimize their yields, sometimes exceeding expectations and gaining temporary favor or a small surplus. Collective action, skillful oral negotiation, and a strong adherence to community customs provided a limited but important buffer against the most extreme demands from above. Even in a system so clearly defined by inequality, the farmers' expertise and resilience carved out small pockets of autonomy, preserving their dignity and sustaining their communities against all odds. The long shadow of wealth and power also shaped memory and oral history. Stories were passed down through generations, recounting how dynastic families first amassed their land and riches, the clever strategies they used to maintain their influence, and the heavy burdens endured by those who labored for them. Oral poetry, work songs, and local proverbs carried timeless lessons about balance, justice, and the impermanence of material gain. Farmers internalized these narratives, giving them a profound understanding of both the constraints of the hierarchy and the quiet rewards of careful stewardship and hard work. Let's pause again. Picture the river mirroring the stars above. The whisper of the wind through the sorghum stalks seems to carry the faint, distant echoes of laborers' songs. Fireflies flicker among the stalks of grain, like tiny, fleeting sparks. In this gentle, quiet moment, you can sense the full arc of inequality. The farmer's sweat, the landowner's gain, and the delicate, intricate web of society that bound them together. Ultimately, this concentration of wealth had an enduring impact on the Songhai Empire. Elite families shaped settlement patterns, controlled access to markets, and influenced major trade networks, leaving legacies that extended well beyond their own lifetimes. Their system of tribute, labor obligations, and agricultural management ensured their authority while also, in its own way, preserving the empire's stability. For the farmers, life remained physically demanding and morally complex. But the structure of the hierarchy, however unequal, sustained society by linking individual effort to communal and eventually imperial prosperity. In the quiet that follows the day's labor, The interplay of wealth, power, and inequality leaves a lasting impression. The farmers' hands bore the weight of history. Their toil-fed dynasties shaped markets and connected the earth to the emperor's authority. In reflecting on this delicate balance, we can see that Songhai society thrived, not despite its deep-seated inequality, but in many ways because of the careful and often ruthless orchestration of labor, tribute, and elite oversight. As evening descends on the vast Songhai fields, a hush falls across the millet and sorghum. The Niger River glistens with the fading sunlight, and its gentle murmur carries the stories of those who labored along its banks. Tonight, we pause to reflect on the lives of the farmers whose hands tilled this soil, their sweat nourishing an empire, and whose endurance shaped the very rhythms of life in the Songhai heartland. The fields tell tales of perseverance and skill. These farmers braved floods, droughts, and oppressive tribute demands. Yet, through resilience, knowledge, and cooperation, they sustained their communities. Each seed planted was a pledge to the land, each harvest a testament to patience, and each season a negotiation with both nature and empire. Their lives, though often filled with hardship, were deeply intertwined with the rhythms of the river, the patterns of rainfall, and the songs of their ancestors. The interplay of labor and authority was ever present. While dynastic families and elite landowners controlled wealth and influence, it was the farmers' expertise that underpinned the empire's prosperity. Tribute and taxes extracted wealth upward, yet these obligations also connected the populace, binding the laborer to the rhythms of Songhai governance and society. It was a delicate balance, one that demanded both respect for hierarchy and mastery over the land. Through song, ritual, and oral tradition, farmers preserved their knowledge and values. Stories of successful harvests, floods overcome, and clever negotiations with both nature and authority passed from one generation to the next. These narratives sustained their identity and community cohesion, offering comfort and continuity in a life otherwise governed by unpredictability and laborious routine. Let's just pause here for a moment. The wind whispers gently through the tall sorghum. Fireflies begin to dance along the riverbanks, and distant drums echo faintly in the night. In this quiet, we can almost feel the invisible threads connecting each farmer's toil to the grandeur of the empire, to the wealth of the elites, and to the enduring culture of the Songhai people. The mysteries of the land, the soil's fertility, the river's moods, and the timing of the rains were constant teachers. Farmers learned from observation, trial and error, and ancestral guidance. This intimate relationship with their environment fostered wisdom, patience, and a deep respect for the unseen forces shaping their lives. Work, hardship, and ritual were inseparable, blending practicality with spirituality in the daily rhythms of the fields. Reflecting on this inequality, we can recognize the duality of Songhai society. Wealth and power concentrated in elite hands ensured stability and facilitated trade, while the labor of farmers created the very foundation of that prosperity. Each role, whether landowner or laborer, was part of a larger ecosystem, a network where survival, productivity, and cultural cohesion depended on the contributions of all. The farmer's dedication was both a personal journey and a collective responsibility, shaping the empire for centuries. Even in the shadow of hierarchy, moments of human triumph shone through. Community rituals, shared meals, celebrations of successful harvests, and mutual aid all reinforced bonds, mitigating some of the burdens imposed by the power structures above. Their knowledge of crops, rivers, and weather patterns gave farmers agency within their constraints. demonstrating a resilience and ingenuity that reverberated through generations. Let's pause once more. The night deepens, stars shimmer over the river, and the gentle lap of water against the banks is like a lullaby. In this serenity, we honor the farmers whose hands held the Songhai Empire together, whose wisdom guided the sowing and harvesting, and whose endurance connected the past, present, and future. As we draw this story to a close, remember that the lives of Songhai farmers were far more than just toil. They were lessons in patience, courage, and harmony with the natural world. Tribute, inequality, ritual, and expertise all wove together a society where each individual played a vital role. By witnessing their struggles and their resilience, we gain a deeper insight into the complexities of empire, the balance of power, and the quiet dignity of those whose work truly shaped history. Tonight, as the fire dims and the river whispers softly, we leave the fields of the Songhai behind, carrying with us the echoes of their labor, the lessons of their resilience, and the quiet majesty of human endurance. The farmer's legacy is the rhythm of life itself, a cycle of planting, tending, harvest, and rest that resonates through time, connecting us to the earth, to the river, and to the heartbeat of a storied civilization. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories from history. You are now under baobab skies.